The war between Ukraine and Russia is currently at a breaking point, on the verge of conflicts between Donbass and Crimea. The most important front line for Donbass is still Bakhmut and the Donetsk trenches around the city. The Ukrainian armed forces realized that they have to seize a strategic advantage here to cut the link between Donetsk and Luhansk. The most important thing is to sever Russia's supply routes, connecting bridges, military, and airbase areas they control in Donetsk. For this purpose, Kiev made significant attacks and advances, primarily in Bakhmut and around the city. Most recently, the Ukrainian armed forces made a major breakthrough south of Bakhmut as the new 3rd Assault Brigade pushed Russian troops out of their trenches along the Donbas Canal, which stretched north and southwest of Bakhmut and secured the Russian defenses in the area. The target was the Russian airbase near Avdiivka in the Donetsk region. Soldiers of the 53rd Vladimir Monomak's Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine launched a mind-blowing attack near Donetsk Airport, 3 kilometers northwest of the western end of the road to the Donetsk airport. The outskirts of the village of Vodiany and the Avdiivka front line were completely closed off by soldiers of the 53rd Separate Mechanized Brigade. While the Russian forces were planning an attack against the Ukrainian troops near the Donetsk airport, the Ukrainians acted faster and carried out an incredible counterattack. It is estimated that the Russians planned this attack to protect their airport and send their fighter jets from Donetsk to Ukrainian cities. However, Kiev's intelligence data on this subject mobilized the soldiers of the 53rd Vladimir Monomak's Separate Mechanized Brigade. Violent explosions began at the Donetsk airport during this striking attack, which even Russia didn't expect, shocking the Kremlin. Russian leader Vladimir Putin was seriously concerned about the loss of advantage of this critical airbase between Donetsk and Luhansk. While the offensive plans of the Ukrainian armed forces were already successfully underway. This is because the Russians were using this airbase to launch airstrikes on the critical front lines of the Donetsk region, especially Bakhmut, Bereshivka, and Krasnohorivka in the north of the city. In addition, this airbase served the Russians to launch airstrikes on Optina, Klyshivka, Kurya, Mavka, and Avdiivka in the south direction of Bakhmut. As a result of the successful attacks of the soldiers of the 53rd Vladimir Monomak's Separate Mechanized Brigade, the Donetsk airbase, which was under the control of Russia, and the settlements near this area came under fire. Currently, it's alleged that the Russians cannot use this airbase to carry out attacks. It was also revealed that during the attack on the airbase by the Ukrainian assault brigades, the Russians faced a huge convoy of reinforcements and military equipment to this airport in Donetsk. This Russian military convoy was almost destroyed by Ukrainian forces on the outskirts of the village of Vodiany in the Avdiivka front line, 3 kilometers northwest of the western end of the road to the Donetsk airport. As a result of these mind-blowing attacks, 9 infantry fighting vehicles were destroyed, and it's claimed that many Russian soldiers were also eliminated during the attacks on Donetsk air base and the clashes in which the Russian army convoy was destroyed on the Dina's side. Moscow noted that urgent security measures were taken in this regard, and Russian military units close to the Donetsk airbase were sent to the area where the attack took place near Avdiivka. Russian troops were stationed in the Yas-Inu Vada settlement. Russian reinforcements here were the 9th Marine Corps Regiment and the 10th Tank Regiment. Since the distance between these two settlements was about 35 kilometers, they couldn't prevent the attack of these 2 Russian reinforcements at Donetsk airbase, nor the destruction of the convoy of Russian troops near Vodiany, west of Avdiivka. Now, Ukraine's stunning success in Donetsk has laid solid ground in Bakhmut. On the other hand, with a few forces in reserve, the Kremlin now has to make a difficult choice. The possibility that the Ukrainian advance in Donetsk will continue into Luhansk may cause Russia to lose this war. But the Luhansk front line is a critical area where the Russians have suffered serious losses recently. Most recently, the Ukrainians destroyed the largest Russian headquarters in Luhansk's Sorokina settlement. A similar move may soon begin around Kremenaya. Will the Ukrainians be able to withstand any new counterattack, and will others support them? With few forces in reserve, the Kremlin has to make a difficult choice. Are the Russians strengthening the southern front to slow the Ukrainian counter-offensive there, or are they strengthening the defenses around Bakhmut to leave the ruined city in Russian hands? If the Ukrainians attack Crimea, will Moscow be able to shift its forces north without exhausting defensive positions elsewhere? Kiev has more options than Moscow as long as it has well-equipped brigades in reserve. Ukrainian troops can explore many aspects by observing the Russians' reaction until it becomes clear which direction represents the best opportunity for a major breakthrough. For example, the 21st Mechanized Brigade with its CV-90s was one of the Ukrainian brigades in reserve until it started moving to the front in the last few days. By commissioning this unit and its powerful tools, Ukrainian planners can achieve one of several goals. They could push back the Russian troops to the north and clear the way for the Ukrainian brigades advancing in the south and in the Bakhmut area. Or if the Russians refuse to redeploy significant forces, the 21st Brigade may find that the Kamenskaya direction itself is ripe for a breakthrough. But for all these purposes, equipment such as artillery, ammunition, and UAVs are vital among the most important military materials at the moment. When artillery clashes have come to such an important position, what is the latest state of Ukraine and Russia in this regard? Both artillery and drones played key roles in the ongoing war. Anton Gerashchenko, an advisor to Ukraine's interior minister, stated that artillery and ammunition rank high in military aid sent to Kiev and that the conflict was a drone war. The Ukrainian army won the artillery war by using much more modern and efficient systems on the battlefield. An analysis of the losses in the war in Ukraine revealed that for every piece of Ukrainian artillery liquidated, 4 Russian guns were destroyed. This ratio is also confirmed by the data of the Oryx project. Thus, during a counterattack, Ukrainian troops proved to dominate counter-battery clashes, which often determined which army won the war. During the 5-week Ukrainian counteroffensive in clashes in the Zaporizhia region and south of the Donetsk region from June 6 to July 13, Russia lost 32 howitzers and rocket launchers. According to the data of war analysts, during this time, the armed forces of Ukraine lost only 8 such weapons. In the same period, according to Oryx, which analyzed the situation on the entire front line, Russia lost 25 towed artillery and 28 multi-launch rocket launchers MLRs, while Ukraine lost 6 towed guns and 2 MLRs. At the start of the war, Russia had about 5,000 howitzers and missile launchers. This figure is 3 times that of Ukraine. Moscow forces have lost a total of 4,402 artillery systems and 3,726 drones since the full-scale invasion of Russia began in February 2022, according to a recent count posted on social media by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Ukrainian troops, who received more than 1,000 artillery pieces from the Allies, compensated for their losses. Now, thanks to the help of the West, values close to these figures for the artillery of the Ukrainian army are preserved. The advantage of the Ukrainian armed forces is that they use Western-made systems that are more reliable, accurate, and long-range than Soviet designs. As for the UAVs, there's not much to say about the Ukrainian armed forces. Ukrainians currently have an effective UAV army. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has made the final point. Putin ordered the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, acting on the Wagner mercenary company, Yevgeny Prigozhin's seizure of Russian cities. Putin gave the expected order for the capture of Prigozhin dead or alive. Putin, who expressed that Wagner soldiers are completely terrorists, made it clear that this betrayal committed by Wagner would be punished very severely. The mistakes that Vladimir Putin has made since the beginning of the war have led him to dig his own well. Although Russia has a regular army, Putin, who is trying to create a new army within the state, has lost all control. Putin is aware that the only way to neutralize Wagner troops is to neutralize Prigozhin, whose name we often hear in the Ukrainian war. The tank brigade has put its soldiers on the move. Vladimir Putin has ordered an attack on the Southern Military Command, known as the command center of the war on Ukrainian territory, which Yevgeny Prigozhin has captured in the city of Rojkov. Putin, who wants to neutralize Prigozhin by seizing the command center where Prigozhin is located. The tank brigade has sent its soldiers to the city of Rostov shortly after the Russian soldiers mobilized to the command center. Prigozhin made statements and released a video in which he expressed his embrace to all Russian soldiers and expressed that they would not have to die for Putin. This video, in which Prigozhin made a statement, spread quickly on social media in a short time and fell on the agenda of the whole world. Meanwhile, Russia's 15th Tank Brigade's soldiers were surrounding the General Command building where Prigozhin was found. Since these soldiers had previously served on the territory of Ukraine together with Prigozhin, Prigozhin had also been the commander of these soldiers. The main task of the Russian soldiers here was to neutralize Prigozhin and completely end this coup attempt. However, Russian soldiers were forced to neutralize Wagner soldiers and Prigozhin, with whom they fought in Ukraine, in order to fulfill this task. The Russian soldiers, who could not remain indifferent to the situation any longer, did not obey Putin's orders and heeded Prigozhin's call. Russian soldiers who came close to the building where Yevgeny Prigozhin was found refused to engage in a confrontation with Wagner soldiers. Interestingly, these soldiers, commissioned by Putin, decided to switch to Prigozhin's side, preferring to join the Wagner soldiers rather than fight. These soldiers, on whom Putin had placed a lot of trust, chose to take Prigozhin's side by betraying Putin. However, when this incident was learned by the Kremlin palace, Putin went crazy. Betrayed by his own soldiers, Putin set in motion his main move to overthrow Prigozhin. It is known that Wagner soldiers, supported by Russian oligarchs since the beginning of the war, have many ammunition depots within the borders of Russia. In these ammunition depots, weapons and equipment belonging to Wagner soldiers, except for the Russian army, were kept. The Russian government kept these ammunition depots almost like a state secret. Prigozhin supplied ammunition and weapons that he had provided to his soldiers from these warehouses. However, having failed to stop Prigozhin within the borders of Russia, Putin decided to destroy these ammunition depots so that Wagner soldiers could not reach. Thus, it was learned that Vladimir Putin, and not the Ukrainian army, was responsible for the explosions that occurred in the city of Kursk and Moscow on the day of the coup. Explosions that occurred in the city of Kursk late at night made the people of the region very nervous. Russian citizens recorded the explosions that occurred in the region on video and shared them on their social media accounts. It was claimed that all of these explosions were airstrikes organized by the Ukrainian army, but the real face of the business was much different. Vladimir Putin had received intelligence that Wagner soldiers stationed in the city of Belgorod had begun to withdraw in order to support the Wagner soldiers who had captured the cities of Rojkov and Voronezh. Putin, aware that the Wagner soldiers who began to withdraw from the city of Belgorod would also take the ammunition weapons they had in the city of Kursk with them, ordered an attack to destroy these warehouses with long-range Iskander missiles. So Putin blew up the ammunition depot so that Wagner soldiers could not supply these weapons and ammunition. The location of these ammunition depots of the Wagner army were kept almost like a state secret. Prigozhin, the owner of the Wagner company, was aware that Putin was the name behind the explosion of this ammunition depot. Realizing that Putin was trying to weaken the Wagner army, Prigozhin retaliated against Putin in a very short time. Russian leader Vladimir Putin made a move on Yevgeny Prigozhin, causing Prigozhin to become even more angry with his move. But there was one thing that Putin had forgotten. A large part of the nuclear weapons with which the Russian army constantly threatened Europe and Ukraine were kept in the city of Rostov, which was under the control of Wagner soldiers. And Prigozhin knew that these nuclear weapons were located in the city of Rojkov. Prigozhin, who wanted to turn this situation into an opportunity and retaliate against Putin, assigned Wagner soldiers stationed in the city of Rostov to seize this nuclear weapons depot. There were no Russian soldiers in the city, as Chechen soldiers and Russian soldiers stationed in the city of Rostov had been expelled from the city. For this reason, Wagner soldiers, who soon blockaded Putin's nuclear weapons depot, moved to seize the ammunition in the warehouse. However, when Wagner soldiers entered the nuclear weapons depot, they found that the depot was completely empty. Vladimir Putin had already emptied these warehouses and removed nuclear weapons from this warehouse. However, Prigozhin's move made Putin and Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu even more angry. Shoigu, who wanted to send a message to Prigozhin, made a whole demonstration to Prigozhin to show that they had more long-range missiles and nuclear missiles than the Wagner army. Thus, the Russian army destroyed a combat helicopter belonging to the Wagner army within the borders of Russia. Wagner soldiers were conducting reconnaissance flights in Rostov airspace with helicopters during the day. During the organization of these reconnaissance flights, the Russian army blew up a combat helicopter used by Wagner soldiers. The fact that the two sides retaliate against each other continues to lead to a further increase in tensions between Prigozhin and Putin. Prigozhin, who went berserk with the destruction of the Wagner combat helicopter within the borders of Russia, called on Russian President Vladimir Putin and threatened Defense Minister Shoigu and the chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov. As it is known, Russian government officials claim that this coup attempt by Wagner soldiers was supported by foreign powers and this coup was carried out by the United States. For this reason, the Kremlin administration, addressing the Wagner soldiers who carried out the coup, made statements that there are still more heroic Wagner soldiers and Wagner soldiers should not come to Prigozhin's game. In the same way, the Russian army generals made statements, addressed the Wagner soldiers who captured the city of Rostov and Voronezh, asking them to lay down their weapons and get out of these lands. Wagner commander Yevgeny Prigozhin responded to all these statements, stating that Wagner soldiers will not surrender and will continue to fight. Prigozhin, who stated that Wagner troops will continue to advance to the borders of Moscow if Russian Defense Minister Shoigu and General Gerasimov do not surrender, once again called for Shoigu and Gerasimov to be handed over to him when Vladimir Putin's plan to eliminate Yevgeny Prigozhin failed. He began destroying Wagner headquarters on Ukrainian territory. These headquarters, which belonged to Wagner soldiers, were to be seized by the Ukrainian army, as it is known. A large number of Wagner troops are withdrawing to Russia's borders by stopping their occupation on Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainian army, which wants to turn this situation into an opportunity, has increased its operations against the Russian army. The Russian army is experiencing a major loss of power in Ukraine, especially in the Bakhmut region. With the withdrawal of Wagner troops from Bakhmut and the return to their headquarters in Soledar, the Wagner headquarters in Bakhmut is completely empty. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, was thinking of taking over this headquarters and turning it into a command center. However, the head of the Russian intelligence service, Sergei Naryshkin, has received information that the Ukrainian army is advancing in Bakhmut. When it became clear that the Ukrainian army was going to take over the areas where Wagner soldiers were retreating, the Russian army moved to destroy the empty Wagner headquarters located in these areas. In other words, Putin even risked destroying the headquarters of the Wagner soldiers who used to work for him. Acting on information obtained by the Russian intelligence service, the chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, fired 6 long-range Iskander missiles to destroy the Wagner headquarters located in the Bam region. While 4 of these missiles successfully hit the headquarters, 2 of them were destroyed by Ukrainian air defense systems located in the region. Since the fronts of the Ukrainian and Russian armies are very close to each other, the missiles sent by Russia were detected by the radars of the Ukrainian air defense system. Nevertheless, 4 missiles successfully hit the Wagner base, and the headquarters was destroyed. Vladimir Putin's information was shared that 2 Hedgehog model armored vehicles and 4 military vehicles belonging to the Russian army were heavily damaged by this airstrike. Wagner troops began to advance towards the borders of Moscow for the first time while Wagner soldiers maintained their presence in the cities of Rostov and Voronezh. A Wagner contingent of 800 people began to move towards the city of Novomoskovsk, which is quite close to Moscow. Realizing that Prigozhin was very serious, Putin, on the other hand, began to increase security measures to enhance Moscow's border security in order to prevent Wagner troops from entering Moscow on the orders of Vladimir Putin. Armored vehicles and tanks began to pile up in the Stupony district, which is only 100 kilometers from the Kremlin Palace. At the same time, a large number of Russian troops are being sent to these regions to create fronts. On the other hand, government trucks are placed on the roads leading to the Kremlin Palace, and it is planned to close these roads if Wagner troops advance. With Wagner's army completely in control of the city of Varanasi, Russian citizens living in the region are making great efforts to leave the city. However, Vladimir Putin is aware that he needs Russian citizens to prevent this coup. It is a well-known fact that Wagner soldiers will not be able to successfully carry out this coup if the citizens revolt. For this reason, the A4 motorway in the Voronezh region has been completely closed. Thousands of Russian citizens were trying to leave the city using this highway. However, the highway is currently closed for use with the closure of the highway. There are queues of kilometers long due to the fact that Wagner soldiers do not pose any danger to Russian citizens. Russian citizens can easily go out on the streets and protest against Putin. Wagner soldiers, who are heroes in the eyes of the Russian people, are very much loved by the people. Putin is seen as responsible for the economic crisis in Russia. For this reason, the Russian people do not find any intervention by Wagner soldiers in this coup attempt. Not only that, but a large number of Russian soldiers began to leave the army and join the Wagner soldiers, as it is known in the middle of the war. A partial mobilization decision was announced by Putin, and about 300,000 Russian citizens were forcibly recruited into the army. These soldiers who were recruited into the army were sent to fight on the territory of Ukraine without even adequate training. Although many war analysts warned Putin about this, Putin again did what he knew and continued to send these soldiers to Ukraine. However, as a result, the number of troops that Putin lost in Ukraine exceeded 200,000. Forced to fight by Putin, these soldiers began to leave the army to support the coup attempt of the Wagner soldiers. Thousands of Russian soldiers involved in the war in Ukraine are leaving Ukraine, along with Wagner soldiers who have begun to withdraw from Ukraine. These Russian soldiers began to move towards the borders of Russia, expressing that they had been sent to their deaths by Putin and that they would do everything in their power to end the Putin regime. Thus, along with Wagner soldiers, the Russian soldiers also moved to advance to Moscow. This ongoing conflict between Yevgeny Prigozhin and Vladimir Putin scares the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, and the Chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, very much because the two names Prigozhin really wants Shoigu and Gerasimov. Prigozhin, who has been fighting on Ukrainian territory since the beginning of the war, expresses that Sergei Shoigu should be dismissed. One of the biggest reasons for this is that Wagner soldiers fighting for Russia in Ukraine are not allowed to use the ammunition and weapons of the Russian army, as it is known. Wagner soldiers have their own weapons and ammunition. However, sometimes these weapons and ammunition are not enough for Wagner soldiers. In recent weeks, Wagner's troops have experienced problems with ammunition supplies as they continue their offensive in the city of Bakhmut. For this reason, Prigozhin wanted to use one of the munitions of the Russian army after the commander of the Russian troops serving on the bomb-up front forwarded Prigozhin's request to the Russian Ministry of Defense. Prigozhin's request was rejected by Shoigu. Bogozhin's request was rejected by Shoigu. So that's when the first flare of the coup was fired. Yevgeny Prigozhin, in his statement from the front, Wagner began to make threats that he would withdraw his troops. Prigozhin, who stated that the Russian army was not allowed to use their ammunition, said that Shoigu should come to the front and fight on his own. Thus, the first escalation of this tension between Shoigu and Prigozhin was laid. Having learned that Wagner troops were withdrawing from Ukraine, Putin also began to withdraw some of the Russian troops from Ukraine in the same way, realizing that a large number of Wagner troops posed a major threat to Moscow. Putin did not feel safe because the vast majority of the Russian army was in Ukraine and ordered a withdrawal. Thus, Putin made the decisive move. The Russian army has started to withdraw from Ukraine, but the Kremlin was jolted by this. When the festivities in Ukraine began, the entire globe was taken aback. With the most recent advancements, the Ukrainian army has now gained the lead in every field. As a result of Putin's withdrawal order, the Russian people revolted. Certain discoveries have arisen in the final days of the Russian-Ukrainian war that will astound the entire globe. Everyone was aware that Putin's army was having a terrible time. However, recent events have revealed that this challenge has now reached a plainly worrisome degree. The Russian army had begun to suffer serious blows as a result of Ukraine's tactical shift and strategic strikes. But as a result of these fresh blows, the Ukrainian army has ensured the Russians' retreat. The Ukrainian army has taken measures to capitalize on the several advantages it has earned over the Russians. Ukraine made a highly clever step when it understood that its dominance over the Russian army and fierce clashes made no sense. Unable to prevent the Russian army from regularly sending troops to certain regions as part of partial mobilization, Ukraine decided to blow up all convoys carrying Russian troops. This crisis would pave the way for the forced evacuation of Russian forces who were struggling at the front. At this time, Ukraine discovered a fairly significant truth. The Ukrainian army, which is making strides against the Russians, has been notified of certain developments in Bilohorivka, and it took the vital move that allowed the Russians to go. The Ukrainian army has discovered that the soldiers in this location require a lot of ammo and weaponry. However, the Ukrainian army has received information from its operatives in the Russian army based on the fact that Ukraine has made some major breakthroughs against the Russians. When it was discovered that the troops in Bilohorivka were progressively revolting, Putin dispatched a huge number of soldiers and weaponry to the region to oppose it. However, the Ukrainian army has begun to prepare for the most vital maneuvers, and it took measures to shift matters in its favor right before the intervention in Bilohorivka. The whole Russian military investment in Bilohorivka would be wiped out by this coup. The troops at Bilohorivka who did not want to fight were split on whether or not to withdraw. The convoy dispatched to the soldiers in this location, however, was intercepted by the Ukrainian army. This convoy's path from near Belgorod was meticulously planned initially. The Ukrainian army then took these roads to take a larger stride against the Russians. These armaments and supplies brought to Bilohorivka were the cause of the troops' rebellion in this location because it was clear that even their most basic requirements were not being satisfied. The Ukrainian army quickly concluded that, owing to the surveillance units, the Russians would be in this territory very soon, and the Ukrainian army stepped in. It planted mines on the ground when the Russian convoy arrived in this region. The Russian troops were taken aback by what transpired when the car in front detonated. As a result, a portion of the convoy disbanded. The Ukrainian army severely damaged the convoy, which it set on fire, and imprisoned all of the troops responsible for the convoy. The Ukrainian army has taken Bilohorivka off the road as a result of this maneuver. Here is the advantage supplied by this remarkable effort that shifted everything in Ukraine's favor. The Bilohorivka military called the Kremlin. He claimed that the soldiers in this area are suffering from starvation, cold weather, and a shortage of treatment. Following that, the Kremlin responded that a convoy would come shortly. However, some of the soldiers discovered that a convoy raid was on its way when they found that they had lost all of their ammo and supplies during the attack. The troops revolted even more. It was discovered that the Ukrainian army will execute an operation in this region right now, and the Kremlin was informed. Putin has to make a choice. Making men in Bilohorivka fight with insufficient weapons and ammo was extremely difficult. He quickly issued instructions for the troops in this region to be withdrawn. Following that, the Ukrainian forces that arrived in the region discovered that the territory had been left to them, and the Ukrainian army achieved its most straightforward win to date. Following these developments, the military body tasked with resolving Russian soldiers' issues with the Kremlin approached the soldiers in Bilohorivka. These troops stated that the administration did not understand them and that many soldiers desired to flee to Ukraine to become captives because the Russian army was startled by such major news. It became a topic of interest how it would attack Ukraine. However, recent advancements have brought about a radical shift in such beliefs, and Putin has made the most significant concession to the military TFR. Putin has been fairly decadent with the military, albeit indirectly, since assuming office. After eliminating a huge number of coup plotters and experienced generals from the Russian army, Putin, who is also scared of the officers educated by them, established a private army for himself to quell his worries. This demonstrates how severely the Russian army has been humiliated. As a result, the Russian army was extremely hesitant to comply with Putin's desires. Putin, on the other hand, detested the Russian military, who were resistant to many of Putin's instructions. One of the main motives for the war against Ukraine, according to certain reports, was to eradicate dissident organizations inside the army. However, the scenario did not unfold as Putin had hoped. When Putin intended to eradicate opposition organizations during the conflict with Ukraine, he turned a whole army against himself. It is unthinkable that he would have succeeded if he had not picked the persons at the top of the army from among his own loyalists. If the Ukrainian army continues in this manner, it will soon accomplish a very large victory and indicate to the entire world that a new force against Russia has been formed. The fact that the Russian army is retreating more and more each day in response to the Ukrainian army's reinforcement has complicated matters. Following these events, Ukraine appears to be taking several steps toward victory. If the Ukrainian army's recent actions continue, the Russian army will face major challenges. Because of these issues, Putin's resignation will once again be on the table in Russia as it has been. While the likelihood of these resignations continuing exists, the comments made by war analysts in this region will reverberate around the world. According to war specialists, it is only a matter of time before the Ukrainian army ends the fight quickly. However, it is now clear that Ukraine is actively making advances in several of the war's most beneficial corridors. Following that, the subject of Ukraine now having the ability to defeat the Russian army in all regions is being debated. If the Ukrainian army's recent advancements continue at their current pace, Zelensky's desires will be achieved in the near future, as a result of the support gained and significant breakthroughs in foreign policy. Following this conclusion, the Russians will have absolutely little chance against the Ukrainian army. The opposition in Crimea began to celebrate when the Ukrainian army, which pushed its will on Crimea, gradually began to succeed in this territory. If these festivities continue in the correct manner, they will be able to provide the groundwork for Ukraine to attain adequate success. Right now, because Russia's army is having a rough day in Crimea, it is well known that the Russians in Crimea are facing tremendous difficulties. The fact that the people in this region do not want Russians is well acknowledged across the world. If things continue in this manner, the Russian army will be allowed to depart Crimea on its own will. Opposition organizations that orchestrate daily actions demand that Ukraine arrives. And if this occurs, it is predicted that opposition organizations would continue to conduct sabotage and reconnaissance. With these recent developments, it is believed that the Ukrainian army, backed by opposition organizations, will invade Crimea and strike the Russian army the most severe blow. With these current events, the whole Russian populace expects Putin to take similar steps toward resignation if he wins this final battle. It is believed that the public would utterly abandon him. The Ukrainian army, which had the option of withdrawing the Russian army from Ukraine, increased its attacks on the Bakhmut front. The admissions of the Russian commander seized on the Bakhmut front have brought Russian President Vladimir Putin into disrepute around the world. A big number of Russian soldiers were seized by the Ukrainian army as a result of a broad-scale operation coordinated by the Ukrainian army. The number of Russian soldiers refusing to combat on Ukrainian soil is growing by the day. Thousands of Russian soldiers attempted to flee the battle in only a few months. However, Russian servicemen were not the only ones escaping the conflict. According to area reports, 11 Russian officers have been apprehended while attempting to leave the battlefield in the previous month. The leaders who were able to flee the conflict either surrendered to the Ukrainian army or defected to other nations. Following the admissions of Russian commander Andrei Medvedev, who escaped the battle and traveled to Norway in recent weeks, another Russian officer revealed Putin's actual face to the world. As you may be aware, Andrei Medvedev, the leader of the Wagner mercenaries on Ukrainian land, sought sanctuary in Norway, where he confessed to the war crimes committed by Putin and Yevgeny Prigozhin. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has urged Russian troops fighting in Ukraine to surrender. We know from the recordings released by Russian soldiers who surrendered to Ukraine previously that the Russian soldiers who surrendered to Ukraine were treated quite nicely. The surrendering Russian soldiers issued a statement in which they addressed their colleagues fighting in Ukraine on Putin's behalf, stating that they should surrender to the Ukrainian army and that the Ukrainian government had supplied all of their demands. Following Zelensky's statements, a substantial number of Russian soldiers attempted to abandon the front lines and surrendered to the Ukrainian army. Russian soldiers are forced to escape the conflict and surrender to the Ukrainian army. Russian soldiers are stranded in Ukraine after Russian President Vladimir Putin stated that Russian servicemen escaping the conflict in Ukraine will be convicted and sentenced to prison. This leaves Russian forces with only one option: to surrender to the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army conducted a massive operation today, capturing 120 Russian soldiers and 2 Russian commanders with the defense lines it has constructed here. The Ukrainian army, which seeks to halt the march of the invading Russian forces in Bakhmut, is refusing to give way to the Russian army. The Russian soldiers have concentrated their efforts on the Ukrainian army's defensive line around the Bakhmut border. Russian soldiers, unable to forecast where an attack would come from, were caught in an ambush by the Ukrainian army. Bakhmut, located in the Donetsk area, has several land links. The occupying Russian troops devised a significant ambush operation as a result of the Ukrainian army's massive strategy. Ukrainian troops in the Ukrainian army-controlled city of Lyman proceeded to pressure the occupying Russian forces. The Ukrainian army, which assembled from Lyman in the Donetsk area, rushed to blockade the Russian forces attempting to conquer the city of Bakhmut. The invading Russian forces were so focused on the Ukrainian soldiers stationed in Bakhmut that they failed to detect another Ukrainian unit approaching from behind. Ukrainian troops deployed in Lyman arrived in Bakhmut and surrounded the invading Russian forces. With the Russian forces blockaded, Ukrainian soldiers guarding the city of Bakhmut began to fire artillery at them. Russian soldiers remained stranded in abandoned structures and bombed out military bunkers that were utilized as military bunkers. When the Russian forces realized there were also Ukrainian troops behind them, they were perplexed as to what to do. Russian soldiers who were attacked from both sides were forced to flee their barracks. Ukrainian soldiers pushed away from the defensive lines and toward buildings where Russian forces were stationed. The Russian forces had little alternative but to surrender when they were surrounded by Ukrainian soldiers. The admissions of one of the Russian officers seized by the Ukrainian army shook the whole international agenda. The Russian captain, who revealed Vladimir Putin's true face and Wagner mercenary firm CEO Yevgeny Prigozhin, shamed Putin in front of the whole world with the publication of the Russian commander's confession video. Ukrainian soldiers established a social media sharing record, according to the Russian commander. Russian soldiers fighting on Ukrainian soil were compelled to battle and threatened with death if they did not. Russian soldiers who have recently arrived at the front as a result of the decision to partially mobilize are vulnerable to threats from Russian leadership, according to the Russian commander. Numerous Russian soldiers who claimed that they did not want to fight for Putin in Ukraine were executed, and they maintained inexperienced and beginner men at the very front of the line. He further claimed that the great majority of the men recruited by Yevgeny Prigozhin were killed. Yet these soldiers were recorded as missing. As you may be aware, Russian President Vladimir Putin has stated that if Russian prisoners die while being transported to fight in Ukraine, their families would be compensated. Well, Putin, on the other hand, refers to Russian detainees who died in Ukraine as missing to avoid paying these expenses. The Russian commander reportedly stated that the men under his charge may only be served one meal per day and that there is insufficient water. According to the Russian commander, they define all of the plans and are compelled to fight the Ukrainian army's activities on their own. Russian leaders at the front do not intervene in the conflict by remaining behind the lines rather than instructing soldiers. Vladimir Putin is officially sending these men to their deaths despite their lack of awareness about the conflict. These growing conflicts inside the Russian military appear to spell the end of Putin. There have recently been many allegations of combat between Wagner forces and Chechen soldiers. It is also claimed that a minority of Russian army members are ostracized by their colleagues. We've witnessed several cases of Wagner troops' aggressive behavior in the service. Previously, Wagner forces had caught and executed a Russian soldier who had managed to flee the fight. Wagner founder Yevgeny Prigozhin received a positive response from the Russian people after uploading this video. However, Yevgeny Prigozhin stated in a casual manner that if we do not make Russian prisoners fight, you will have to fight, and everyone who wants to come to Ukraine may do so. These impulsive responses by Prigozhin shown yet again that he did not regard the Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine. Russian nationals who do not wish to fight in Ukraine are attempting to avoid Putin's decision to mobilize. Russian President Vladimir Putin has formed various squads to track for minority soldiers who have gone into hiding to escape entering the Russian army. These Russian military units are presently operating in the Crimean Peninsula. Russian military are going through the homes of minority inhabitants in Crimea, one by one, seeking those who are trying to hide. As you are well aware, the great majority of Crimean inhabitants support Ukraine. These residents who want Crimea to be returned to Ukrainian control are opposing the invading Russian army by organizing resistance groups among themselves. The Fire Resistance Organization is the most well-known of these organizations. These revolutionary citizen organizations sought to damage many munitions dumps controlled by the Russian army on Ukrainian territory. Not only that, but they damaged several of the Russian army's transportation channels for weapons shipments to Ukraine. Pro-Ukrainian militants have just blown up a railway shipping route utilized by the Russian army, preventing the Russian army from making supplies to Ukraine. There are several cases like this. He also believes that these rebel organizations are responsible for recent fires and explosions within Russia's borders. When the Russian army captured Ukrainian land, a substantial number of Ukrainian residents were relocated within Russian boundaries. These displaced folks are creating resistance organizations in Russia and attempting to disrupt Putin's critical infrastructure. If the battle continues, Putin appears to be in for some rough days, as he will have to fight both in Russia and in Ukraine. Crimea will end the war between Ukraine and Russia. We have heard these statements many times from the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Reclaiming the historic Black Sea Peninsula is Ukraine's most ambitious goal and the Kiev leader's biggest dream, extending to the Black Sea and bordering the Sea of Azov on one side. Crimea is a vital piece of the regional strategic puzzle and key to protecting lucrative commercial shipping routes. We know that Ukraine is struggling with all its might to achieve this goal, while the counterattack operations that Kiev started in June continued fiercely. Kiev forces struck the Kerch Bridge. A Ukrainian cruise missile attack forced Russia to temporarily close the £3 billion 10 pence mile bridge connecting Crimea. Russian air defense claimed that they shot down a missile near the crossing built by order of Putin. One report suggested that this was an intervention by the 31st Air Defense Division north of Taman on the Russian side of the bridge. Apparently, the missile was shot down on the Kerch or Crimean side of the bridge. Telegram channel Ribber reported no damage or loss of life. The channel stated that the wreckage fell into the waters of the Sea of Azov. The channel suggested that Ukraine used a modernized missile from a redesigned S-200 complex for attacks along a ballistic trajectory. This range is about 400 kilometers. The pass is Putin's main link to the Crimean Peninsula. Russian war channels predicted that Ukraine would make new efforts to demolish the bridge, which was seen as Putin's flamboyant project to connect Russia to the occupied peninsula, which under international law belongs to Ukraine as a result of the attack. While the traffic stopped on the bridge in both directions, queues formed. The attack came as Putin tried to encourage Russian tourists to visit his traditional summer playground, Crimea. The head of the Russian puppet government in Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov, claimed that air defense forces shot down a cruise missile in the Kerch region. Sergei Aksyonov stated that there was no damage or casualties. Aksyonov said, "I ask everyone to stay calm and trust only reliable sources of information." The statements of the Crimean official were not enough to calm the public. The inhabitants of the peninsula have been seriously worried for a long time because Crimea and its surroundings are a critical region that is constantly the scene of air attacks. Therefore, the inhabitants of the peninsula hastened their plans to escape from Crimea. There were even people who sold their houses in Crimea. The people of the peninsula do not want to live in a great chaos environment. In this regard, the Russian authorities are trying to appease the people in Crimea by hiding the existence of the danger. Moscow uses its own media powers for this. However, these efforts of Moscow do not yield any results. Residents of Crimea are taking action to leave the region. Vehicle queues to Russia were seen on the occupied peninsula. So what has happened recently on the routes to Crimea? At least 3 missile attacks were carried out on the Chongar Bridge between Crimea and Kherson. Judging by the published photos, not only the pavement, but also the power structures on the bridges were damaged. Traffic on the bridges came to a complete standstill. It was reported that many bridges on the border between Crimea and the Kherson region were damaged as a result of the bombardment. Representatives of the occupying authorities claimed that Storm Shadow missiles were used for the attack. An important supply link to the Russian forces was rendered ineffective after the attack. Chongar Bridge is located at the entrance of Crimea to Ukraine. Kerch Bridge and Chongar Bridge are the 2 main connection roads connecting both Russia and Ukraine. Chongar Bridge is the shortest route that allows the Russian army to access all regions through Melitopol. It should also be noted that not 1 but 2 bridges were hit in Crimea. Chongar is strategically important to the Russians, and it's no wonder they are also panicked. Specifically, as you've noticed, we're all talking about bridges over there. There are reports that the railway bridge from Crimea was also damaged. This will seriously affect the logistics and supply of the Russian army. Bridges are temporarily closed, and support points are damaged. The critical logistics line passing over the bridge between the Sea of Azov, Black Sea, Crimea, and Ukraine has so far provided 70% of all the logistics of the Russian army in southern Ukraine. Bridges were probably shot from a great distance. The normal distance of the Chongar Bridge is actually within the range of HIMARS, but it would be much more effective to use ballistic missiles to create a strong and irreparable impact on the line. In addition, when Ukraine fires these missiles from a distance of more than 200 kilometers, it will remain at a safe distance in the firing zone. The fact that the Ukrainian forces carried out the attack from a distance of 220 to 270 kilometers is the most strategic result. On the other hand, two American experts argue that there may be an easier way to liberate Crimea from Russian control rather than a costly ground attack. These ways are to use unmanned boats to attack Russian forces and blockade the peninsula. Two researchers, William Courtney and Scott Savitz, wrote in an article that Ukraine does not need to drive invading forces from Crimea to make it less hospitable to Russia's aims. Defending the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia occupied and annexed in 2014, has historically presented a dilemma. A land invasion from the northwest, a direct route, must cross the narrow and easily defended Perekop Isthmus between the peninsula and the mainland. On the other hand, an enemy army could just as easily block communication between Crimea and the mainland. The geography that makes it difficult to occupy Crimea facilitates a modern siege. Courtney and Savitz wrote, all Russian movements by and must pass through one of the two restricted corridors. The first requires traversing hundreds of miles of occupied territory, including areas relatively close to the front and creeping in with hostile populations, saboteurs, and special forces. The final isthmus is a target-rich location with minimal room for maneuver and within range of available Ukrainian weapons. This departs from the Black Sea route. Ideally, Ukraine would either initiate amphibious invasion of the peninsula or starve the Russians through a naval blockade. But the Ukrainian Navy, despite losing its flagship, is still weak. To defeat Russia's Black Sea Fleet, which has about 6 diesel-electric submarines, as well as several dozen missile-armed frigates, corvettes, patrol ships, and other support vessels, Ukraine can use explosive-laden unmanned surface ships to damage and destroy Russian ships. Ukraine has already used USVs to damage Russian warships and attack the Russian naval base in Sevastopol at the southern tip of the Crimean Peninsula. USVs are well suited for network swarm attacks and are relatively low cost. Their newly revealed designs can be modified to make them more stealthy and harder to detect than most crude ships. Sinking a warship in a closed channel can create obstacles that will take weeks to clear or longer if under fire. If sea and land connections to Crimea are closed, only air transportation remains. Supplying Russian forces on the peninsula, including the Black Sea Fleet, would require much greater airlift capacity than Russia has. Ukraine can reduce this flow by targeting runways and fuel facilities on the peninsula. Ukrainian forces, reinforced by other weapons, could prevent Russian forces from using it as a safe haven to attack the mainland or threaten Black Sea shipping. Russian forces in Crimea, shaken by attacks, short of supplies, and somewhat isolated, may become less capable. A Navy aircraft blockade has risks. It is possible for Russia to develop some defense or countermeasures against USVs, especially if they have naval and air superiority over the Black Sea. Perhaps the biggest downside to a drone blockade is the time it will take. Siege warfare has always been slow and arduous. It is one thing to undermine the capabilities and morale of the Russian forces by interrupting their supply lines. If the ultimate goal is to liberate Crimea and drive the Russians out, as Ukrainian officials have repeatedly promised, this may require a ground attack.